Hello, my name is Carlos Buso. Today I'm going to present our project Language-Specific Adaptation for Cross-Lingual Speech Emotion Recognition that we have been working at the University of Texas in Dallas. And with my students have been already Naini and Praveen Motin. Emotion is very important. It plays a crucial role in human interactions. It changes the way that we communicate with others. It changes the way that we think and is reflected in our speech, in our facial expressions. Other people perceive that information and respond accordingly. So being able to recognize emotion can enable us to build systems that are more engaging and more effective. In the context of content triage, in the context of security and defense, it's very important to recognize emotions. Imagine a large amount of speech recorded that has to be analyzed. If we are able to identify potential threatening behaviors or recordings with specific emotional context, that can be quite useful to identify segments that we need to analyze with more detail. Some of the challenges in speech emotion recognition is that there's too much variability. There is a speaker variability. The descriptors that we use to describe emotions change from conditions and recordings. There's also confusions at the accuracy level between emotional categories, and some of the results strongly depends on the conditions in which the data is recorded. And as a result, the laboratory results do not represent the type of results that you should expect in the wild. So we need to find strategies to generalize speech emotion recognition systems in new domains. This project in particular focuses on the linguistics or cultural aspects of mismatches between training and testing domain. And this is a very important problem because there are differences between languages. There's, for example, some tonal languages versus non-tonal languages. And this has implications in prosody features that are used often to communicate emotions. These variations and expressions also change depending on the culture. So a system that was trained in one particular data from one particular culture not necessarily will adapt to another culture, recordings from another culture. So we need to find effective ways that we can use databases in resources and resources in languages that we do have a massive amount of resources, and use the information to recognize emotions in other languages where we might not have the same amount of data. So we're going to focus on cross-language speech emotion recognitions. And our belief is that this should be much more than just cross-corpus evaluations, where we consider just two languages as two different domains. There are aspects that are important, linguistic aspects that we need to take into consideration that can make our system more robust. So the model, the project that we be working this year has three aims. The key idea is to train a system that is based with American English as our source domain, and we would like that models to work well in another language that we would call it the target domains. In this context, we're going to explore three different aims. The first one is to explore acoustic differences at the phonetic level across languages caused by emotional behavior. The second aim is to understand the generalizations of a speech emotion recognition systems when they're training one language, English, and testing in other languages. And the third one is to find strategies that are language specific that can be adapted to improve performance in cross-linguistic experiments. So let's start first of all some of the results that we have obtained in aim 1. So one goal for us was to analyze the similarities and differences at the phonetic level across languages. The approach that we followed was to quantize the space using a common space and use that space to find the similarities at the phonetic level between two different languages. So what we did was to find we used 2.7 million frames collected from databases in English, Chinese, and Russian. We merged them all together and we used k-means algorithms to cluster the space into clusters. For this, we use the speech representation web LLM, which is a self-supervised learning representation that is very popular in the speech processing. And the idea, after we cluster the space, which again, this is initialize or visualize in the space as a two-dimensional space with cluster with different names. We count how many frames were assigned to each of these clusters, which is represented by this histogram that we see on the slide. So using this strategy, what we did was to sort the number of clusters from the ones that have more sample assigned to them to the ones that least, and that's shown here on the MSP podcast. And we also, keeping that order fixed, we did exactly the same for frames coming from all the databases. And you can see for both Mandarin and from Russian, we see that the distributions are quite different, indicating right that the languages, the acoustic informations in the other languages change. It's not exactly the same as the one that we see in English. The other aspect that we did was to do an analysis at the phonetic level to understand, for example, where different particular vowels right belong in this within these clusters. And what we did was to consider, for example, the vowel A, and we found right the distributions on the MSP podcast, in the Mandarin database, and in the Russian database. And we found again, right, that they were quite diverse. There's aspects that are common, right, but for the most part, right, they use different space. They have different distributions. So what we did after that was to take these assignments, we normalize them, and we compare them using the divergences measurements, and we will look at the similarities at the phonetic level by considering the difference in the distributions for different languages and for different phonemes. So here in this plot, we see the different vowels, A, O, U, I, and O. And these vowels, right, we look at different emotions as well. And the number that I'm plotting here is the equivalent divergence. So lower number means they're more similar. So when we look at this table, we found that the phoneme, this phoneme, right, is the one that has the smaller number, meaning that it's more similar across to these two different languages. In this case, for this study, for this slide, I'm going to show English and Chinese, right? But the same we could compute across other languages as well. When we look at the plot, the TSA plot, so which visualize the space in a two-dimensional space, we see that there's a lot of overlap of where these phonemes lie in this space for these two phonemes. Excuse me, for these phonemes for the two languages. In contrast, right, the vowel U is quite different across the two languages. You see that the numbers are quite larger, and we see again, right, that the overlap between the two languages is less clear in this plot, showing again that there's this things are different across languages. The result I want to highlight for aim number 2, where we look at the ways that we can generalize speech emotional recognition systems trained in English and tested in other languages. So I want to highlight one of the studies that we reviewed this year that is based on trans-BQEK framework. The key idea here is you want to use a quantified space, and you have different frames coming from one domain, this say the English database, and this is another domain coming from the say Chinese database. And what we do here is we take the current frame, which is highlighted in X, and we found the closer codebook, right, that a shared codebook between the two languages. And then we concatenated the original frames, which is again represented with X, with the particular codebook that is associated with that particular frame. And then this model goes into a bottleneck layer representations, right, and then to a classification stage. So that's sort of the key idea on this formulation. So the key aspects of this model, right, is the global loss, because it has three losses, right? The global loss, what it aims is to sort of align the two domains, right, which is highlighted here in this block in the middle. And then it has local laws, where the idea is to align the classes within the domains, right? So which is highlighted here under the last part of this plot. And in addition to these, the global and local losses, we also have a cross entropy loss that deals with the main task, which is recognizing emotions. So we try these models, and what we found here is that when you don't have any adaptations, when you train them all in English and you test it in Chinese, we see that we have accuracy of 53%, and an F-score of 0.48% in the 4-class problems. And when we use the framework that we're providing, right, we obtain performance that are quite better, right? We go all the way to 0.58% and on accuracy and 54% on F1. So we do improvements, show improvements, right, by using this framework. The other strategy that we did was to rely on preference learning. The idea is that humans are better to recognize at relative comparisons as it comes to emotions. So it's easier to say, for example, this is more positive, this sample, than this other sample. And the idea here is to build models that can capture this preference. And what we like to explore in this context is an approach for unsupervised domain adaptations that take consideration differences between the languages. So the idea here is, instead of training this model with samples that say this is angry, happy, sad, or this is a very positive or very negative, what we do is to find pairs of samples and compare them based on an adaptation. For example, if we're looking at the valence, which is negative versus positive, we can say one sample is positive, the other one sample is negative. So here, for example, the way that you formalize it, you have a distribution, and here you pick a sample from one side of this distribution, this margin in the middle that is represented by this gray region, and then a sample from the other sample. So as long as there is a different distance between these two samples, right, you said one sample is preferred over the other. And the formulation that we use is based on the RankNet framework. The idea is you have a function, you get a representation out of the two samples, you get a function here that processes the acoustic information of these two samples. The function is exactly the same, so they share weights. And the idea is to train this probability on top, right, that is going to be equal to 1 if sample I is preferred over J with respect to that dimension, or J is preferred over I with respect again to these attributes. And this probability is a sigmoid function, and that is mapped into a cross-entropy loss that is described here on the slide. Now, this is we have been used this before. It has very, very effective. What we found to be very interesting is to adapt this model in a way such that one sample belongs to the source domain and the other sample belongs to the target domain. So in the experiments that I'm going to show, we are going to look at different approaches. And the first one is without any unsupervised domain adaptations. And in this case, you just train the models on the source domain, right? And you just apply in the target domain, and no adaptation. One of the approaches, domain adaptations, unsupervised domain adaptations that have been very effective for us is adversarial domain adaptations, which is highlighted here on the plots. The idea is that you have a chair representation, you have a task classifier that recognizes emotions, and you have a domain classifiers. You want your system to be very good at recognizing emotion, but very bad at recognizing whether the sample comes from the train and the test domain. In order to do that, you reverse the gradients such that this part you're not able to distinguish between the two domains. So at the end of the training, the chair representation, right, achieve a representation that is common for both domains. The proposed approach that we have here, so is represented here in this figure. So what you see here is the source domain and the target domain. We do have labels for the source domain. We don't have any labels from the target domain. Here, the color represents an attribute. For example, red might be very positive, blue be very negative, and because we know the level, we can sort them. And the approach consists as following. We're going to pick some sample from the very top of the list, so we know it's very positive, and we're randomly going to select another sample from the target domain, and we're going to make this pair. As same as well, right? We're going to pick from the very bottom of these representations. We're going to select samples that are very negative again, and randomly pick one sample from the target domain, expecting that the sample from the source domain is going to be less preferred than the sample from the target domain in this particular condition. We're also going to add this adversarial loss, which is we described earlier with the adversarial domain adaptation, to make sure that our systems don't basically have our cover representation be similar for both domains. And finally, we're going to predict the samples, the motions on the target domains. And if the samples are very similar to what we're trying to achieve, for example, high valence, right? Or they're very positive, we're going to identify those samples, are going to remove them from the list so that we don't pick them, right? Which will help us to identify pairs that have the right preference to avoid mistake at that level. So the results that we obtain with the BAM databases are shown in these pictures. What we show is that the best performance that we found is with the proposed unsupervised adaptations, right, with this adversary loss and pseudo levels. We found that that's leads us to the best performance, which is much better than what you will achieve if you were using no adaptation whatsoever. We found here we found the performance as we pick more and more samples from the top of the sample or top of the bottom, and we found that if you pick from 10% all the way to let's say 25% of the list, right, you're going to lead to improvements, but they're much better than what you will achieve with a model that does not make any adaptation, which is represented with this solid line. We apply this model also for categorical emotions, which is we apply something very similar. What we did was to pick anything that has one angry, for example, in the source domain where we do have labels, and we pick one sample randomly from the target domain, expecting that sample hopefully is not angry, and we run these experiments again. And what we found here again that our models, right, when we propose the proposed approach with the adversarial loss and with the pseudo removed, right? So we identify samples with that target emotion, so we remove them so we don't pick them from the list, lead to pair performance that are very close to the results that you will achieve if you were to train this, if you were to train it, right, with the action levels, right, where you know the labels on the target domain, so, which is highlighted as a upper bound on the last column, row in this table. Finally, right, in the last aim of this project, we will look for explore language-specific approaches to adapt a system trained in English and to be used in another language. And as an example of the studies that we did on this particular aim is shown here, where we look at aligning the distributions of emotions. In many cases, the problem that we found is that the type of emotional displays that you will find in one domain are quite different from the emotional displays that you will find in another. For example, you may have a database that has been collected with very colloquial recordings. However, your target domain might have very negative emotions, so there's a mismatch in the distributions of emotions. And what we did here, the idea was to match the distributions of the target domain by doing undersampling. So, for example, we remove certain samples from the training domain in order to have similar distribution. So what we found, again, case one is when we don't do anything. We just have, we just train with the whole databases. Case two is when we remove samples to match the distributions of our target domain. And we found clearly improvements across board, right? When we look at arousal and valence in our three databases that we have been working on for this particular project. Now, of course, this assumes that you have the labels on the target domain because you want to you're trying to match the distributions, so you need to know the distributions of the emotions in that particular domain. What happens when you don't have it, right? So in this particular case, what we did was to we create pseudo levels. So we go into our target domains, right? We predict the emotions and we use those predictions to find the distribution, the target distribution, and with that we undersampling our training set. And we found that the performance, right, even though it's not as good as case two, when you do have the label, right, it's still much better than the case when you have no, you train with the entire database. Finally, right, we look at case four is where we do an iterative process where we train the model, right? The model get better, right? So we try it again. So we look at the distribution. We use the distribution to match the distributions of the target domain multiple times till the model converge, right? And we found that this iterative approach to conduct these experiments again leads to improvements in certain cases.